Hey, our topic today is separation anxiety. It's presented by Ellie Brown, Caitlin Denton, myself, Stephen Durham, and Laura Leedy. Why is this topic important? Okay. The separation anxiety disorder affects many children in the U.S., and it has lifelong consequences for their emotional maturity. And emotional maturity is clearly a big factor in how people relate to each other and how well their relationships go as they go through life. Just a quick story about that from my life is that about 10 or 15 years ago, I facilitated some classes at our church that were court ordered. People were court ordered to be there, and they were mainly really abusive men. And one thing that we kind of theorized is these men were very emotionally immature. And what we often discovered is that it was because of some trauma or separation anxiety early in their life, in the first year of their life. So that's one reason this is very important. Any child who changes their primary caregiver often can be affected and can develop SAD. And, that can happen in many ways. One way it can happen is if someone is a baby just in their first month or two of life is sent to a daycare center where they have many people taking care of them. And that's less healthy than someone who might go to a daycare where only one person takes care of them. And as a result, the next point, children who receive consistent care early on see the world in a healthier way than those who do not. And that would be a clear benefit if you have a child to putting them in a daycare where they only see one person or two people, something like that. But adopted children are specifically affected by this. And some of the statistics on adoption are that 135,000 kids are adopted in the United States every year. And 38% of those were adopted after the first few months of life. And so what that means is, if you do the numbers, that over 40,000 of these kids did not have a stable long-term parent in their first year of their life. More on why is this important. Early life experiences play a huge role in the child's emotional growth. Some of the research has shown that adopted children, for instance, are more likely to have mental health issues. And through thousands of interactions, children form a template for relationships that can carry on for their entire life. And what would that template, just talk about that one for a second, what would that template look like in a child who's raised in a healthy environment with one or two primary caregivers? Is that they would see that caregiver, they would grow attached to that caregiver. Then that caregiver may go away, leave the room for a little bit. The child might get a little distressed, but then the caregiver would come back, and over time that child would learn that caregiver is always going to come back. And that would be a healthy template for future relationships. If they don't get that template, then it's hard to recover. If they do not have a solid attachment with one person early on, then they do not feel secure. And again, that goes back to that template that they would develop in that case. Bowlby, who did a lot of research on attachment and attachment disorder, and particularly early attachments in a child's life in the first year or two, postulated that if a child hasn't developed a secure attachment by the age of 5, he would suffer severe consequences that he would likely not be able to recover from. And so that just underscores how important it is. By the age of 10 months, most children have more than one attachment. Some of the problems that are encountered are addiction issues, defiance, hyperactivity, and those are all common among adopted children, much more common than they are among non-adopted children. One thing that's interesting is that kids in foster care do much better than kids in orphanages. And when you think about it, that just makes sense because orphanages change caregivers far more often. If somebody's in an orphanage, they might have numerous caregivers. I had 3 adopted grandkids that were raised in foster care, and they are healthy, emotionally, well-adjusted people. They're just 10, 11, 12 years old, but they're healthy and well-adjusted. 3 adopted children of a friend were Russian orphans, and they were raised in orphanages. They have continue to have severe problems, and they're well into young adulthood at this point, and they had huge attachment issues all their life, and those have continued into their adulthood. So anyway, just to restate that, while adopted children are easier to identify as having SAD, any child who experienced a change in their primary caregiver or multiple primary caregivers early in life can experience the results of it.
So the topic of separation anxiety also affects minority populations in a different way, and it's important as counselors to be aware of how this affects different groups in different ways. So it's found that lifetime separation anxiety disorder, this article looked at both in childhood and long-term, but that lifetime separation anxiety disorder was significantly associated with being female, having low through high average compared with high education, maladaptive family functioning childhood adversities, other childhood adversities, and a variety of lifetime traumatic events that was associated with separation anxiety disorder. So the MASC, or Multidimensional Anxiety Scale for Children, was the tool that was utilized by these researchers, and they state that this is the greatest utilized tool to gauge anxiety in youth. They found that in Hispanic children that separation anxiety was found more, and that within males, that the African American children had the greatest amount of separation anxiety. Separation anxiety is found to be more common among Hispanic children when compared to non-Hispanic white children. But in spite of these studies, some would argue that this does not exist, these discrepancies. And with that, it was in regards to research that was focused on Black and white youths. And then research has found that separation anxiety disorder is typically lower in white children compared to those. They looked at some subgroups, so Filipino, Native Hawaiian, and Asian American groups, along with several other anxiety disorders. So that was a huge kind of, they talk about this huge study that was conducted in Hawaii, and it kind of compared different subgroups. So Native Hawaiian youth had a greater incidence of separation anxiety when compared with Filipino American, Japanese American, and white youth. But when the parents were studied, there was a higher level of anxiety, including separation anxiety, in Filipino American parents compared to white parents. And it's also been found that Native Hawaiian children display a higher level of separation anxiety than Japanese American and white children. So Native Hawaiians tend to exhibit more familial closeness, which may lead to symptoms of separation anxiety. So it's important to look at these factors because it does impact those we serve as counselors. Being aware and just having that cultural competence to know how minority populations are affected maybe differently and different factors, like they see here with the familial closeness that could influence disorders like these. And so we'd all agree that it is our role as counselors to know about these disparities and how they influence our practice.
Next, we're going to talk about why separation anxiety is important in the field of counseling. So first of all, I thought it would be important to just think about what would really happen when separation anxiety disorder goes undiagnosed and untreated in children and youth. And studies have shown that in childhood years, anxiety is likely to continue if it goes untreated. And often this can just look like stomach aches, headaches, things like that in the child, and parents might not really realize that it's actually an anxiety issue. I think it's a physical issue. So they can have these symptoms, but if these things aren't treated, then it can lead to highly negative effects in the child's social life, their emotional and familial well-being, and ultimately it can affect the overall quality of life for the child. Just even kids with severe anxiety may not even want to go to a party. That just if they have a lot of social anxiety or just things that kids typically do, it affects them having the kind of life that we would want any kid to have. These childhood issues can continue into adulthood if not treated also, which can ultimately lead to worsened anxiety disorders, and that can lead to things like depression or suicide or substance abuse. And furthermore, and why it's important in the field of counseling is that the treatment of these disorders can actually help families, and strong families see reduced numbers of anxious kids. So highly stressed families are more likely to see higher stress levels in their children. This is what studies have shown. And working with families on strategies to reduce tension is huge in curing childhood anxiety issues. So if the family is on board and they're trying to create a stable environment for the kids, it's going to be like the foundation for everything else. If they have a lot of upheaval in their surroundings and their family, it's going to be hard to cure it. Overall education of parents can help in the prevention and lessening of separation anxiety, and often that's the job of counselors. In the same way, building intelligence about post-adoption strategies when we're thinking about that population and healthy parenting approaches can prevent more severe separation anxiety in adoptees. And looking at this and why it's important in the field of counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy came up a lot. It seems to be a really important part of treating this disorder. Currently, evidence shows that cognitive behavior therapy is the most effective in alleviating and curing childhood separation anxiety and SAD, which is the same thing. Cognitive behavior therapy uses cognitive restructuring as well as techniques to reduce anxiety. And some of the techniques they use in this cognitive behavior therapy are breathing, training, retraining, progressive muscle relaxation. I've actually known kids that have learned the progressive muscle relaxation too, and it's to help clients learn how to combat their own anxiety. It's a very effective thing. I've actually even used it on headaches. When I was a kid, I was taught how to use that, and you can get over tension headaches. So that's pretty interesting.
All right, we're going to go a little bit more in depth with the treatment for separation anxiety. Most common ones are CBT, family therapy, pharmacological treatments, or a combination thereof. Research studies agree that a combination of treatments is usually considered the most effective, though. It's also essential that parents and caregivers are integrally involved in both treatment planning and implementation of the important roles that attachment figures play with separation anxiety disorder. CBT, for pediatric anxiety, utilizes a number of intervention strategies, including psychoeducation, relaxation training, cognitive restructuring, problem solving, gradual exposure, and relapse prevention. Treatment course is typically brief, usually 10 to 16 weekly 50-minute sessions, and emphasizes the importance of homework or out-of-office practices. Although pharmaceuticals have been proven effective for most anxiety-related disorders in youth, research suggests that the only potential medication for separation anxiety disorder is imipran, which is only effective about half of the study population. Unfortunately, though, there has not been very much research on pharmaceutical treatment for separation anxiety alone. In the majority of studies, children with SAD have been included among larger samples of children with various types of anxiety disorders. Research points to CBT as the most favorable method for effective and appropriate treatment for childhood anxiety. Through this psychological treatment approach, youth learn to identify anxious thoughts and cognitions and practice replacing previous maladaptive patterns of behaviors with more adaptive ones. Specific attention is given to the reduction of both irrational fears and avoidant behaviors. The most common of these is called a step-by-step approach using CBT and parental training, which goes through a series of 7 steps working with both child and the parent, typically involving interviews with both separately, as it'll convince the children to talk more truthfully about things that they're going through, as well as not become more frustrated by their parents and what their goals are. The steps are to target anxious thoughts and behaviors, and then rate the anxious behaviors on scales of 1 to 10, agree on challenges to work on, identify and teach strategies to practice, note and chart progress made, offer incentives to motivate, and reinforce progress and increase challenges. Throughout this process, it is very important for counselors to make the client understand that they are the ones in charge and that they can slow this process down or change their order of what they believe is the most important and how scary it is to work on them. Even though the parents have their input as well, it's important that the child understand that this is something that they're in charge of in their process. Throughout the week can go up and down, and learning how to manage anxiety takes time and practice. Many children don't need to be medicated if they engage in CBT, but it depends on the severity of the symptoms and the ability of the child to respond to treatment. Other variations of CBT with separation anxiety include Coping Cat, Friends, and Camp. Coping Cat teaches children how to restructure negative and anxious thoughts and how to use adaptive coping strategies through graded exposure to anticipated or actual situations. Friends stands for Feelings, Relax, Inner Helpful Thoughts, Explore Solutions, Now Reward Self, Don't Forget to Practice, and Stay Cool. It provides targeted support for groups of children with anxiety, as well as interpersonal therapy, universal preventative care, and parental education. Child Anxiety Multi-Day Program, also known as CAMP, was created specifically for school-aged girls diagnosed with separation anxiety, and it involves the use of a peer support with socially active settings. However, fear of social scrutiny within a peer group may be a contraindication for a subset of those who present with both social and separation anxiety disorders. One of the more popular and effective family-based treatments for separation anxiety disorder is parent-child interaction therapy. Although originally intended for children with opposition to defiant or conduct disorders, this type of therapy has been adapted to address the needs of children with SAD. It involves the 2 phases of child-directed interaction and parent-directed interaction. However, it can also be adapted to treat children between 3 and 8 years of age, and that includes the CALM approach, which is coaching approach, behavior, and leading by modeling. There are also several scriptures that relate to separation anxiety. Several scriptures that relate to separation anxiety that can be comforting to children and adolescents. One comes from Genesis 31:49 that states, "The Lord watched between me and thee when we are absent one from another." Jesus also talks to his disciples, who are portrayed and theorized by some as having separation anxiety during the Last Supper, where Jesus tries to reassure them that he will never leave those who believe in him. Psalms 139, verse 7 through 12 also sings about how God is always with us no matter where we go. There is nowhere that we can go to flee from him.
In conclusion, separation anxiety disorder affects many children in the U.S. and has lifelong consequences for their emotional maturity. MASC, or Multidimensional Anxiety Scale for Children, was the tool utilized in the research stated above, and is a really great resource to gauge anxiety in youth. In childhood years, anxiety is likely to continue if it goes untreated. This can lead to highly negative effects on the child's social, emotional, and familial well-being, and ultimately affect the overall quality of life for the child. CBT, family therapy, pharmacological treatments, or a combination are recommended.